So if you watched my previous videos, you would have noticed that I talked about the 80-20 rule for consuming content, which is really just the idea that every week you should spend more time reflecting on the content rather than just being like a content machine and just consuming and ingesting more and more. And that's what I realized of late, because what I was doing for all these past weeks was consuming a lot of stuff but not really taking the time to process it and actually make something out of it and make my own thoughts from it. So in this video, I thought that I'll share with you a few things that I've learned in the past week, and some things that have affected me, some things that have inspired me, and some things that have sort of shaped my thinking. I've spent a lot of time rereading and re-listening to the stuff that I'm going to be talking about, but really overall the idea is to share with you something that has stuck with me and show to you a practice that I've started to follow of late. So I want to talk about three things really. One is a blog post, how to understand things, something that I've talked about a lot in my newsletters and even in a podcast. The second thing that I want to talk about is an interview with Marc, who I really admire and whose interview has really shaped a lot of my thinking in terms of setting goals for yourself and actually making progress on it. And the third thing that I want to talk about is really a podcast by Seth, Godin. It's called the Akimbo podcast, and it's absolutely just fantastic how Seth is able to just power pack a lot of stuff in just 10 to 15 minutes of content. So let's get right to it. So the first thing that I want to talk about is really this blog post, how to understand. And I think I really like this piece for a few reasons. The first reason is that it teaches you and it inspires in you the will to think. Nabil, who's the author of this post, talks about the idea that, well, thinking is a hard thing. And what happens over a period of time is that we don't realize, but we don't actually take time out to just think and process all these ideas and things that are going on around us. And so he writes that one component of it is energy. Thinking hard takes effort, and it's much easier to just stop at an answer that seems to make sense than to pursue everything that you don't quite get down an endless and rapidly proliferating series of rabbit holes. And this is absolutely amazing because understanding something obviously requires time and it requires a lot of cognitive effort. And Nabil is saying that because thinking is hard, that is one of the biggest reasons why people just don't understand most of the things that they think they do. And just putting it into words and realizing that the biggest component of understanding things is energy was just absolutely amazing. The second reason why I like this piece is because Nabil teaches you that intellect and understanding things is as much about virtue, intellectual integrity, and all of these things rather than just pure raw intelligence. And he says that another thing the parable about the bricks tells us is that understanding is not a binary yes or no. It has layers of depth. My friend understood Pythagoras' theorem far more deeply than I did. He could prove it 6 different ways and had simply thought about it for longer. And he says that to really understand something, a concept, an idea, a phenomenon, you have to spend time with the material and not just prove a theorem just one way and be done with it. And that's the entire idea that Nabil is trying to say in this blog post, which just absolutely struck me. And going forward, that's something that I'm going to do. Well, to just spend time with the material and be intellectually honest with the stuff that you're consuming. The third reason why I really like this piece was Nabil asks a series of questions that are very simple in retrospect. But when you think about it, they're actually the most profound questions, because if you can answer these questions about something that you're trying to understand, you know for sure that you have actually understood that thing to its core. And the three questions are, but what exactly is X? What is it? That's the first question. And this is obviously sounding a bit weird because I'm pulling it out of context, but if you read the entire post, which I'll link in the description, it's absolutely amazing the way the piece just flows. The second question that Nabil talks about is, why must X be true? Why does this have to be the case? And the third question he talks about is, what is the single fundamental reason? Do I really believe that this is true deep down? Would I bet a large amount of money on it with a friend? And just these three questions are absolutely amazing, and they serve as like principles for me to really test whether I truly understand something or not. The second post that I want to talk about is actually an article on Marc, and I want to talk about two concepts that Marc talks about in this interview. It's an absolutely fantastic interview for anyone who's interested in learning more about productivity, self-improvement, entrepreneurship, venture capital, technology, building companies, processing information. It's got basically everything. And the first thing that really struck me from this interview was about goal setting. Marc says that it's really hard to get good metaphors, but it's poker, right? It's really, really, really hard to be a good poker player. And if you're kicking yourself every time you have a bad hand, the bad habits just simply happen. You just need to be able to have a system that lets you think through the process. And so the interviewer says, Thinking in Bets by Andy Tuke is one of the best books on this. And then Marc says, yeah, exactly. Michael Mauboussin has also written extensively in his books about this as a profession. The craft of investing as a process of separating process and outcome. We are almost entirely a world of trying to optimize the process. And what I really took away from this excerpt was that you need to think about goals not in terms of outputs, but in terms of inputs. What exactly can you do to reach a particular state rather than reaching the state as is? So let's say if one of my goals is to write, 50 posts a year. That is an externally defined goal. However, according to this, I should rephrase my goal and say that I don't want to write 50 posts a year. What I want to do is spend 2 hours every day just writing. And defining goals in terms of that input-oriented process rather than an output-oriented outcome is actually the difference that Marc is talking about over here, which really struck me. The second reason why I like this article was, again, it tells you that you have to have time to think. Just sit and think and reflect on the stuff that is going on around you. And Marc says that, we've both worked with executives where they were scheduled to the nth degree. The three things you tend to notice with executives like that. One, they just never have any time to actually think, and that turns out to be a fairly important thing. Two, they have a hard time adjusting to changes in circumstances. In our business of venture capital, you get a lot of problems that come up. There's a lot of firefighting. It's like those classic movie scenes where there's a huge crisis and somebody calls out to the secretary, cancel my schedule. Well, maybe you wouldn't need to do that if you had some flexibility in your calendar. And then there is the third thing, but really this is the excerpt that actually struck me, that you have to have time to think. And Marc just emphasizes that, and that coming from someone like Marc is also something that holds a lot of credence for me. And just this article and interview in its entirety was absolutely a fantastic read, something that I highly recommend to just checking out if you're into all the fields that I've talked about before this. The third thing that I want to talk about in this video is the Akimbo podcast by Seth Godin. And the reason I like this podcast is because Seth manages to pack as many insights in as few minutes as possible. And I read about this metric somewhere. It's called, instead of measuring how long or short or famous a podcast is, you can use a new metric to actually measure the efficiency of a podcast. And that is called the insights per minute. And really the idea of insights per minute is how much value, how much bang do you get for your buck? And just measuring Seth's podcast from that metric really got me thinking about how much value I actually derive. And in this particular podcast of Go Invent Something, Seth talks about the idea of pre-stealing. And pre-stealing ideas is basically this phenomenon that when you want to take credit for something you already knew was done before you came up with it, or claiming that someone stole your idea before you could get around it. The entire idea that Seth talks about in this podcast is that in the 1980s, when people were playing Nintendo games, Seth was the first one to think about streaming Nintendo games on VHS cassettes and actually selling them. And in 2015, Twitch got acquired for $1 billion by Amazon. And you can see how the parallel over there is that Seth actually acted on it in 1980s and built the first ever video streaming platform. Then Seth also actually got the idea for developing the HomePod, because when the iPod came around, Seth thought that could we use radio waves to broadcast the music on your iPod to external speakers? And that's where the idea of MagSense and then HomePod got developed from. And so Seth is basically saying that if you want to invent something and build something valuable, you have to have three things done for you. First, you got to be willing to try enough ideas so that most of them actually fail, which is totally okay. But the point is that you're willing to go to the extent to just try out many ideas. The second thing that Seth is talking about is that you have to be inventing in time of a structural shift, which really means that at the time that Seth was doing these things, there was a media revolution taking place, there was a technological revolution taking place, and that he's saying that external shifts should be happening for you to leverage everything that's happening externally. And the third thing that Seth talks about is that you have to be willing to spend enough time and devote years to that idea of yours for it to actually come to fruition. You can't just say that, oh, I had an idea, but because I didn't act on it and someone else did, well, that idea is mine. And just having this clarity in your mind in just 15 to 20 minutes was absolutely amazing. And that's why I think that Seth's podcast was one of the best podcasts that I've listened to in a while, and why I have been thinking about it over the past week or so. So yeah, these were really the three things that struck me. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Let me know how you feel about it, and as always, use the 80-20 rule to consume content. Thank you.